the creation of a new species. How does a species come to be? And in order to answer this question, we need to ask ourselves, what is a species? How do we say, oh, this is one species of ant and this is another species of ant? What's the difference between them? Okay, and we normally use this thing called the biological species concept. This is the most common way of determining whether or not two organisms or two individuals are members of the same species. And it says two individuals must be able to reproduce and produce fertile offspring. To be members of the same species. Now, this is an okay definition, or an okay idea to say this is what one species is and this is what another species is. But it's got problems, and the problems are that they are referring to these under what they call normal conditions. Two species would be able to reproduce under normal conditions. And so there's a lot of controversy as to what that means. So consider that there were two similar species of squirrel. Right? One of them lived on an island that was 1,000 miles off the coast of California, and one of them lived in California. Okay? Are those two species going to reproduce? No. Why not? Because there's a big freaking ocean in the middle of them, right? And are squirrels good swimmers? No. So they're probably not going to swim 1,000 miles to reproduce. What if we took one? What if we landed on the island on a helicopter, took a couple of those squirrels, and then let them loose in California? Would they reproduce then? Maybe. Who knows? But what if they did? What if they reproduced and they were able to produce fertile offspring? Are they members of the same species? Then we have weird things happening. Because they were able to produce fertile offspring, yes. But is that a normal condition, hitching a ride on a helicopter and being dropped in California? No, that's probably not a normal condition. And so in that case, there's a little bit of, variance in what we'd use to define species. It's possible that, some species in Africa would be able to reproduce with some species in Florida, right? But we call them separate species because they're so far apart from one another, right? And so if they have the ability to move those 1,000 miles, like if, the squirrels were really good swimmers or something, then it is a chance that we would call them the same species, but likely, since they're so isolated like that, we wouldn't, okay? So these things are all called reproductive isolations. And most of the time we err on the side of making more species than making less species. So reproductive isolation is any mechanism that prevents reproduction. And we're going to divide them into two main groups, and then we're going to subdivide one of those groups. So the first group that we're going to subdivide into two is called the pre-zygotic mechanisms. Okay, and again, we're going to divide this up a little bit more. So these are going to be the pre-zygotic mechanisms that prevent mating in the first place. So no mating can happen. First one of these is called a geographic isolation. Okay, and this is what I was talking about with the squirrels. Okay, this is a physical barrier that these squirrels are not able to pass. Okay, and that prevents those two populations from mixing. Physical barrier prevents two populations from mating with each other. Okay, so let's say that there's a fish, a breed of fish, right? And they're all living in a lake, right? All of them together. And then that lake, they build a road in the middle of it. So they fill in the lake, right? And they build a road through the middle of the lake. And now instead of having one lake that had this one species of fish in it, now you have two lakes, right? Are those lakes are the fish in one lake going to be able to interbreed with the fish in the other lake? No. Are they immediately separate species? No, probably not. But given enough time, could they turn into separate species if different mutations built up in each side? Absolutely, right? Now, what about if it's a lake that constantly floods and it constantly, the water level goes over the road and then it mixes? Will they ever become separate species? Probably not, because that's going to lead to gene flow. What's up?
Like those finches from
the Galapagos?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if they, I guess, fly to Ecuador and stuff, could they mate since they're different?
We'll talk about it. Yeah. So keep that question in your head for just a second here. Okay. So the next thing, and so in those finches, geographic isolation was definitely the beginning. It was the thing that started the process moving along. The next thing, though, that took over was something that's called behavioral isolation. Okay, behavioral isolations are differences in courtship rituals. Between species. Okay, so I often make the joke about this that a cat, so let's say a male cat and a female cat were courting each other, right? And the male cat brought a flower, in its mouth to the female cat. That's not going to do anything. That would do just as much as me bringing a dead mouse to my date, right? And being like, look what I got you, right? That's not going to have any good effect, right? And so as organisms or as populations remain separated by geographic isolation, it's possible for the behavioral isolations in them to build up, okay? So in the case of the finches, all of the finches have separate mating songs, right? And so if you're not singing the right song, you're not attracting a mate. Right? And so that prevents interbreeding between those species of finches, not because they can't physically do it, but because they don't do it because of behavior, differences in behavior, right? Like I said, the difference between the flower and the dead mouse, right? That's just as severe as the differences between songs in these birds. Like if you're singing the wrong song, you might as well have brought a dead mouse on your date. Yeah.
Will they ever catch on?
It's possible. It depends on the circumstances, right? So let's divide these up even more. Let's divide up the behavioral isolations even more. Some of them are behavioral, but they're behaviors that can't be controlled. Okay, so these are like things like temporal isolation. Temporal means time. So these are differences in mating season. Okay, so mating seasons are important. Some species are only fertile during certain times of the year, right? And the time, and the males are pretty much fertile whenever, but the females are only fertile during the mating season, right? And in those species, the males only have the desire to reproduce during the actual mating season, right? So if you have the males that have the desire to reproduce, but the females are infertile of some other species, then there's not going to be any mating that occurs there because the females are going to be not fertile, right? So they're not going to reproduce, even if the males want to, or vice versa, right? And so in this case, this is going to be another thing that has some weird connotations to it, some weird caveats to it. So like, let's say I had two species, and they were very similar, but the only difference was that they had different mating seasons. And then I gave the female a shot, right, that caused her to ovulate and caused her to become fertile, right? At that point, the male could reproduce with the female, and they could produce fertile offspring. Does that mean that they're the same species? No, because injecting them with a hormone that makes them fertile is not normal circumstances, and so we would still consider them separate, right? Habitat isolation. In some species, there's not even a physical barrier in between them, but the niches that they are going to occupy are going to stop them from really coming into contact with each other, okay? So organisms may share the same physical space, but occupy different niches. Preventing mating. Okay, so we could talk about a lizard here. One lizard that lives on the ground, another lizard that lives in the trees, right? So a ground lizard is going to be good at maybe burrowing, right? And a tree lizard is going to be good at climbing and jumping and things like that from tree limb to tree limb. And so it's unlikely that the lizards that live in the trees are going to come into contact with the lizards that live on the ground, right? And therefore, even though they might be able to interbreed, they won't interbreed because they're living in different spaces within the same habitat or within the same ecosystem. Another thing that could happen here is if they're nocturnal versus diurnal, right? So if one of them's awake during the day and one of them's awake during the night, it's not likely for them to interbreed because they're going to have different waking periods. So again, different species would, or different mutations would build up in those gene pools as a result. Okay. Next, so these things are all pre-zygotic that prevent mating from happening in the first place. Then there are pre-zygotic ones. Pre-zygotic isolations that prevent fertilization. So in this case, mating occurs, but something doesn't work out with the mating. Okay, so number one, the first thing is called Gamete Incompatibility. And you probably didn't learn this in Hope, so I'm going to take a second, do a little bit of sex ed. You guys don't have to draw this. Okay, so here's an egg, right? And the egg is surrounded by a membrane of proteins, like this. Okay, and so you guys have probably seen the Discovery Channel stuff where you've got all the sperm cells. They're all kind of lined up like this. Right, and they're all trying to get into the egg, right? They're in a race. And you know, the first one that gets in there, then it causes a change in the chemical composition, and that prevents another sperm from getting in. So only one can get in, right? So when they're doing this, the question that I have is, what are they actually doing when they're swimming against this egg? Are they eating it? Do they have a little mouth that they're chomping away? No? So how do they ever get into the egg? Well, you might not know this, but the tip of the sperm has a little pouch on it that's called the acrosome, right? And this little pouch that's on the end is filled with an enzyme, right? And it's filled with an enzyme that specifically breaks down the membrane of the egg, right? So this enzyme that's in the acrosome matches the proteins that are surrounding the egg. Okay, and so if you had one sperm from one species and an egg from a different species, it's very likely that the acrosome, that the enzymes that are in the acrosome there are not going to break down the proteins that are surrounding the egg. And so even if mating occurred, it's not like you're going to have any crossbreeding here between these species because fertilization could never happen, right? Even if the sperm was right next to the egg, that sperm is unable to get inside and fertilize that egg because the enzymes that are in the acrosome are not compatible with the proteins from the egg, right? So this is just gamete incompatibility, which means that the enzymes on the sperm are not compatible with the proteins around the egg. Mechanical isolation. So the simplest way to define mechanical isolation is that the parts don't fit together. So they want mating to occur, but it's just not going to happen, right? So the reproductive organs do not fit together. It's a strange, strange world out there, let me tell you. Today's the day, one of the days of the year that I take my job into my own hands and I Google kangaroo vagina. Because, you can't really see it super well, but this is what a kangaroo's vagina looks like. It's very strange, right? So you've got a single vaginal opening here, and then you've got 3 tubes. You've got a tube here, a tube here, and a tube here, right? This tube is the birth canal, right? So this is where the little baby Joey comes out, right? This tube is connected to this uterus, and this tube is connected to this uterus, right? So a male kangaroo's penis has to be curved so that it gets into one of these side tubes here, because this center tube doesn't accept sperm. If sperm tries to travel up here, it's not going to get into the uterus, and that's going to prevent any fertilization from occurring. And so you could have a species of kangaroo with a straight penis that wouldn't be able to reproduce with this particular kangaroo here because it's got to hit one of these side vaginas, and in order to do that, it has to have the correct curvature, right? Like I said, it's a weird world. This is really cool, though, from a natural selection standpoint, because this means, and we know kangaroos are marsupials, right? And so they have pouch, and that's where the majority of the gestation is going to occur for the little baby kangaroos, little joeys, right? And so this allows them to essentially be constantly pregnant. They're like little baby kangaroo machine guns, right? So you've got the ability for this uterus to have a developing joey in it. And at the same time, when there's a developing joey in here, there could be a developing joey in the pouch, and this uterus can ovulate, right? And then allow for that kangaroo to become pregnant again. And so they have like all these offset pregnancies at the same time, right? And so this is, if being biologically fit is being able to produce the most offspring, like this is producing the most offspring, yeah.
So with a kangaroo with a pouch, like, do they give birth outside the pouch and like kangaroo jumps in, or like?
Oh no, so kangaroos, when they're born, when they're little baby joeys, they're like this big, right? And they have the ability to crawl, and so they actually crawl out of the vagina, right? And then grab onto the hair and then crawl their way from the vagina into the pouch where they latch onto a nipple, and then they remain there. But they crawl. The mother has nothing to do with it. Just like this little mini kangaroo is just like crawling its way. It's kind of terrifying to think about, but. All right, so these are pre-zygotic. Let's talk about post-zygotic. postzygotic isolations. So this is if a zygote was able to form. So mating happened, fertilization happened, and now there's a zygote. Number one, you've got zygote mortality. Most living organisms have sort of like a self-check at the very beginning of their life in about the 8-cell stage or sometimes the 16-cell stage where the zygote has divided a couple of times, and then it's going to do a double check and it's going to be like, okay, we've gone through a couple divisions. Do we have all the chromosomes that we need in order to form a healthy adult, right? It's going to check for certain things, and if it doesn't pass that check, then it's going to die. Right, it's going to go through apoptosis and self-abort, right? So a zygote may abort if critical proteins are not present. So like if it's missing, some protein that's on some chromosome that didn't get included because it was from the mother or the father or something like that, and one of the species had it and one of the species didn't, then that zygote might just abort. Okay. Hybrid sterility. Okay, so if two different species, are able to have an offspring that's not considered its own separate species, it is called a hybrid, right? So a mule is a hybrid of a donkey and a horse, right? A liger is a hybrid of a lion and a tiger, right? But ligers and mules are not species. They're not their own species. And the reason for that is that they have hybrid sterility. This means that two species can create an offspring which would be called a hybrid. But that hybrid cannot produce offspring. Okay, now there's some, again, weirdness to this too. We used to think that all ligers, for instance, were sterile, and that has been disproved. It is in fact only male ligers that are totally sterile. But a female liger can reproduce with a male lion and produce something that's called a liger, right? And then the other way around is true. So if you have a male lion and a female tiger, that produces the liger. But if you have a male tiger and a female lion, that produces something that's called a tigon, right? And tigons can only reproduce with male tigers. They can't reproduce with male ligers, or male lions rather. And so you can make a tigon and a liger, right? But you can't make a liger or a tigon. Yeah.
So like the offspring, the only way they can reproduce is if they're like
Only the females can reproduce, and they can only reproduce with one of the parent species. Right, so the ligers can only reproduce. The female ligers can only reproduce with male lions, not male tigers. Right, so it's a weird compatibility of chromosomes. Right, what's up? I don't believe that the ligers can reproduce with anything. I think they're like totally sterile. Yeah. All right, so the other option, and so we'd still call them hybrids because the liger can't reproduce with a liger, right? So there's no liger babies. It's only different things, right? Sometimes, though, they can. Sometimes they have something that's called reduced F2 viability. And reduced F2 viability means that even if the hybrids can actually reproduce and produce fertile offspring, that their offspring are messed up, right? They're just not biologically fit, right? So offspring of hybrids may have serious health issues.
Do the hybrids themselves have health issues?
Some of them do, but not all of them. In fact, the interesting thing about ligers is that the lions and tigers both have different genes that control for how big they get, right? And in a tiger, it's on the male chromosome, the male sex chromosome, and on a lion, it's on the female, right? And so if you have a male lion and a female tiger, and they produce a liger, they don't get any of the things that control for their size, and so they're significantly bigger than both lions and tigers. In fact, I have a picture here. This is Hercules the liger. He's massive, absolutely enormous. Like, yeah. And yeah, that she's like her and this other like weird dude who looks like Conan the Barbarian. They have this big tiger rescue. They call it a big tiger rescue, and actually most like PETA hates them, and most wildlife groups hate them because they do all these interbreedings of all their species to try to like see what they can make. But basically, all of the results that we have as far as, oh, look, a lie tigon doesn't work, but a lie liger does work, is the result of these people here who have their own bunch of big cats that they interbreed. But yeah, you can see how big he is. He's giant, right? And he's giant because he doesn't have any of those mechanisms that control for his size, and actually he continues to get bigger. Yeah.
So where would you find a liger
You wouldn't. There's no such thing as a real world liger because the populations are separated from one another geographically.
Oh.
What's up?
Can you do that with like a puma or a panther?
Yep, there are lots and lots of panther hybrids. Some of them are actual hybrids, and some of them are their own species, even depending on what they're interbred with. There was I'll try to find it. There was a big Reddit post like 2 years ago that was all of the different hybrids like that exist between like big cats and things like that, and it's pretty interesting. I'll see if I can find it. All right, so reduce F2 viability. So I want to talk a second about this, just a refresher on what F2 means. F2, so the parent generation, so if we were talking about like liger or something like that, the parent generation would be the lion and the tiger, right? Then F1 is all of the ligers, right? And then if it was possible for the F1 generation for a liger to reproduce with a liger, right, they would produce an F2 offspring. And so what I'm saying is sometimes those hybrids produce F2 offspring that are just messed up. They have like retardation, or they're missing parts, or they're very sickly and they don't have the correct immune system. Their immune system attacks itself. So just big problems that make them biologically unfit so that they're not going to continue on as a species. Questions on this? All right, that is all.